Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the complete history and timeline of Skyrim's Argonians, from the ancient swamps of Black Marsh, where sentient trees once gave a people their very souls, to the docks outside Windhelm's walls where their descendants labor still. We'll walk through centuries of bondage, a war that reshaped an empire, and the quiet lives of the Saxhleel scattered across every corner of this frozen land. As always, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. And subscribe if this helps you sleep. The roots before memory. Long before there was a Skyrim to walk through, long before Windhelm's walls rose over the Sea of Ghosts, there was a swamp in the south called Black Marsh. And in that swamp, there were trees that could think. To understand the Argonians, the reptilian people, the game calls Saxhleel in their own tongue. You have to start there, in the humid dark beneath the canopy, because everything about who they are traces back to a single relationship that no other people in Tamriel shares. The Hist, sentient trees, rooted so deep into the province that some accounts describe Black Marsh's very swamps and waterways as extensions of their nervous system. If you have ever picked up a flask of high sap in your travels through Skyrim, you are holding a fragment of something closer to a god than a plant. The game treats it as a simple alchemical ingredient, something to toss into a potion for a health boost, and most players walk past it in the ingredients menu without a second thought. But that sap is described in the game's own lore texts as being made from the Hist's very spirit, and when an Argonian licks it, the Hist can speak to them through visions. It is not medicine, it is communication. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes everything else you will hear tonight. Every Argonian you have ever met in Skyrim, whether it was Talon Yei pouring drinks in Riften, or stands in Shallows, muttering about his skooma cravings on the Windhelm docks, carries within them a soul that, according to their own belief, does not originate from them personally. It comes from the Hist. When an Argonian hatchling emerges from its egg near a heist tree in the marshes of Black Marsh, it is given sap to drink, and that sap is what grants it a soul in the first place. When that Argonian eventually dies, wherever they die, whatever they become, their soul is believed to travel back across the length of Tamriel to return to the tree that gave it to them, to be held there until another hatchling is ready to receive it. It stands to reason that this creates an entirely different relationship with death and identity than most of the other peoples you have encountered in your travels. A Nord fears the void or hopes for Sovngarde. An Argonian, based on what their own traditions describe, is not so much an individual soul passing through one life as a borrowed spark, cycling endlessly through a tree that has watched their entire species since before written history began. It is worth pausing on how strange and how telling it is that a substance this sacred to an entire people should sit, unremarked upon, in the inventory of a merchant who has no particular relationship to Black Marsh at all, purchased by adventurers for the modest boost it grants their own health regeneration, and rarely, if ever, considered for what it actually represents to the people it was taken from. This is, in miniature, the whole story of how the wider world of Tamriel has generally chosen to relate to the Argonians across the centuries, taking what is useful, setting aside what would require actual understanding, and moving on to the next transaction without ever asking what was given up to make that transaction possible in the first place. Consider what this means the next time you walk past an Argonian selling fish on a dock or fencing stolen goods in a back alley. Every one of them, however far they have wandered from Black Marsh, however Cyrodiilic their adopted name has become, is tethered by belief to a swamp they may never see again, to trees that some of them may never touch. Based on what we know of this belief system, and given how many of Skyrim's Argonian characters were plainly raised and have lived their entire lives far outside Black Marsh, it seems reasonable to assume that a considerable number of them exist in some degree of separation from the Hist that their own tradition considers essential to a complete life. This is not a claim the game states outright about any specific named character, but it follows naturally from the belief structure itself, once you know how thoroughly it depends on physical proximity to a history. One interpretation of why so many Argonians in Skyrim seem quietly guarded, why so many of their storylines circle around isolation, addiction, or the search for belonging, is exactly this inferred distance. They are, in a very literal spiritual sense, likely to be far from home in a way that a human or an elf simply is not. One tribal account worth returning to here, since we only touched on it briefly earlier, adds an important texture to this picture of internal division that later became so exploitable from outside. The Adzi Kostlil are only one of many distinct tribes historically scattered throughout Black Marsh, each maintaining its own relationship with its local history, its own customs, and often its own political interests, separate from and occasionally opposed to those of neighboring tribes. This fragmentation is worth remembering precisely because it complicates the tendency, easy to fall into after an evening spent tracing grand wars and sweeping reckonings, to imagine the Argonians as a single unified nation acting with one voice throughout their history. They were not, and in many respects, still are not. The Hist itself may be understood as a single vast, interconnected consciousness by some accounts, but the tribes who tend individual trees scattered across the swamp have historically operated with a level of independence that made both slavery and eventually resistance to slavery considerably more complicated affairs than a simple story of oppressor and oppressed can fully capture. The origin of the Argonians themselves is treated with more ambiguity than almost any other race in Tamriel, and this ambiguity is not an oversight. It is baked into the lore on purpose. One account, gathered from in-game text and the broader mythology the Elder Scrolls games draw from, holds that the Hist created the Argonians specifically as a response to the arrival of other races on Tamriel. The reasoning given is almost tender if you take it at face value. The Hist, being trees, being rooted and immobile and vulnerable, feared what these newly arriving peoples might do to them, and so they shaped a race of mobile, adaptable beings who could see where the Hist's fixed eyes could not, walk where their roots could not reach, and defend them if defense became necessary. Under this reading, the Argonians are not simply a people who happen to live near the Hist. They are, in some foundational sense, the Hist's hands and feet in the world, an extension of the forest's will given scale and claw and the capacity to think for itself. Other tribal accounts differ, and it is worth noting these differences rather than smoothing them over, because the plurality of Argonian creation myths is itself telling of how fractured and tribal Black Marsh's culture has historically been. The Adzi Kostlil tribe, for instance, holds a very different cosmology, one describing a struggle between two primordial spirits, a great root called Atak and a hungering serpent spirit called Kota, who fought and consumed each other until their identities blurred and something new was born from the collision, a being that combined them both. It is easy to skim past a detail like this, but it says something meaningful about Argonian self-understanding, that even their origin myths are built around merger, around two things becoming one, without either fully disappearing. Root and serpent, stillness and hunger. Whether or not any individual Argonian you meet in Skyrim believes this particular myth, the theme recurs throughout their culture in Black Marsh. Identity as something shared, split and rejoined, rather than fixed in a single body from birth to death. This exploitation was not confined to Black Marsh's own borders either, and it is worth knowing how far outside interests were willing to go to get their hands on it. Historical accounts describe the Blackwood Company, a mercenary organization operating well outside Black Marsh proper, going so far as to smuggle an entire living history out of the province and transport it all the way to their headquarters in the city of Leowin, where they extracted its sap directly for their own use, treating a being the Argonians consider close to sacred as nothing more than raw material to be harvested at a distance from the people who actually understood what it was. It stands to reason that when you find a simple flask of his sap sitting in a merchant's alchemy inventory somewhere in Skyrim, priced no differently than a sprig of nirnroot or a jar of frost miriam, you are looking at the tail end of a much longer and more troubling supply chain, one in which a substance described as being made from a sentient being's very spirit has, through centuries of contact with outside cultures who never shared the Argonians' reverence for it, been reduced to just another commodity on a shelf. What all these accounts agree on, and what the game itself treats as bedrock law rather than speculation, is that the Hist and the Argonians are inseparable, and that the relationship predates every other political or religious structure that would later be imposed on Black Marsh from outside. Before the Empire ever drew a border around the province and called it a territory to be governed, before the Dunmer of neighbouring Morrowind ever looked south and saw an opportunity, the Hist trees stood in their swamps, and the Saxhleel tended them, spoke to them, and organised their entire understanding of life and death and self around them. When you find Hist sap in Skyrim's marketplaces, sold by Argonian merchants who may have no idea how it was gathered or from which specific tree it came, you are looking at the last thin thread connecting a dockworker in Windhelm to a homeland thousands of miles south that most of them will never walk in again. There is also a darker layer beneath even this. Later texts and interpretations, gathered from across the series rather than Skyrim alone, describe hallucinogenic and even monstrous side effects among Argonians who consume too much Hist sap directly from the source, developing symptoms with names like gold tongue and bark scale, their bodies visibly reshaped by prolonged communion with the tree. This could imply that the bond between Argonian and Hist is not the gentle spiritual partnership it is often described as in polite conversation, but something closer to dependency, even possession, a relationship where the smaller party does not always retain full control. It also explains why outside forces, from the Blackwood Company smuggling entire trees out of Black Marsh to extract the sap for profit, to Telvanni mages in Morrowind restraining Argonian slaves who showed magical aptitude tied to the Hist even while they slept, have historically tried to weaponize or exploit this connection, rather than understand it. The Hist made the Argonians, or shaped them, or granted them their souls, depending on which account you trust. And for thousands of years afterward, nearly everyone else on Tamriel has tried to find a way to take a piece of that power for themselves. This then is the foundation beneath every Argonian you will meet as you travel through Skyrim. Not simply a lizard-like race with a talent for lockpicking and an affinity for water, though the game's own character sheet will tell you exactly that if you check the race selection screen before starting a new save. Underneath the mechanical description is a people whose entire concept of self is on loan from a forest of thinking trees, whose religion has no single central authority, whose homeland is dangerous even to its own inhabitants, and whose relationship to identity is built on themes of merging, borrowing, and cycling, rather than the clean individual soul that most of Tamriel's other cultures take for granted. Keep this in your mind as we move forward tonight, because everything that happens to the Argonians afterward, the centuries of slavery, the war that reshaped an entire province, the discrimination you can watch play out on the docks of Windhelm with your own eyes, only makes sense once you understand what was taken from them, and what, against every possible obstacle raised against them by history, they have never quite let go of. Chains across the border. If the Hist gave the Argonians their sense of self, it was the Dunmer of Morrowind who, for the better part of several centuries, tried to strip that self away entirely. And this history is not tucked into some obscure lore book you need a treasure hunter's patience to find. It sits, quietly and almost casually, in plain sight throughout Skyrim itself. In books you can pick up off a shelf. In dialogue you can trigger just by standing near the wrong two people at the wrong time. In the very architecture of how certain cities are laid out. The relationship between Dunmer and Argonian is one of the oldest and ugliest power imbalances in all of Tamriel's history, and to understand why an Argonian dock worker in Windhelm might flinch at an unkind word from a dark elf passing by, you need to understand that this flinch, if it exists in any given character, is not paranoia. It is inherited memory. Slavery in Morrowind was not a fringe practice carried out by a rogue faction operating outside the law. It was, for the vast majority of Morrowind's history under the Great Houses, entirely legal, entirely sanctioned, and entirely built around the assumption that beastfolk, a category that included both the Argonians and the Khajiit, were not fully people in the way that Dunmer, or even other men, were considered to be. The language used by the Dunmer to describe this belief, preserved in in-game texts, is stark. Beastfolk were considered animals, domesticated chattel, no different in the eyes of Dunmer law than a horse or a plough ox. Useful, ownable, and disposable. Argonians were, by a wide margin, the most commonly enslaved people in Morrowind's history, taken from Black Martian raids that spanned centuries, transported north across the border, and put to work primarily on the sprawling salt rice plantations controlled by House Drez, whose entire economic model depended on forced Argonian labor. Thousands were held in what the historical record describes as infamous slave pens in the city of Tyr, shipped out by smugglers along routes running up the bitter coast, funneled into a system that had been running in one form or another for longer than most of the empires that would later claim to have reformed it. It is worth pausing here on a detail that complicates the simple picture, because complicating the simple picture is often where the most honest history lives. Some accounts suggest that the Dunmer did not always need to raid Blackmarsh directly to acquire slaves, and that this may have been because Blackmarsh itself was so dangerous to outsiders. Its swamps thick with disease that the Dunmer had no natural resistance to, that a full-scale invasion for the purpose of slave-taking would have been suicidal. Instead, some interpretations point toward internal Argonian tribes, such as the Archaean, who are described in surviving records as having made considerable fortunes by capturing rival Argonians from other tribes and selling them onward into the Dunmer slave trade. If this reading holds, and it is one that the game's broader lore leaves somewhat open, rather than settling definitively, it means that Blackmarsh's fractured tribal political structure, the same lack of unified central authority we touched on when discussing the Hist, and its many competing creation myths, may have been actively exploited from within before the Dunmer ever needed to exploit it from without. This does not excuse what the Dunmer did with that opportunity. It only suggests that the tragedy of Argonian enslavement has layers that go deeper than a single external villain, and that Black Marsh's own internal divisions were, at points, a wound the outside world learned to press against. Resistance did not require perfect circumstances to matter either, and it is worth noting one detail preserved in the historical record that captures just how bitterly contested the border between slavery and freedom remained even at the height of Dunmer power. Advocacy on behalf of enslaved Argonians was not conducted only from within Black Marsh itself. An organization known as the Argonian Mission operated out of Ebonheart, inside Morrowind's own territory, led at one point by a figure named Imkeliah, whose recorded words carry a bitter, pointed frustration at the wider world's silence on the subject, criticizing the imperial cult specifically for failing to speak out against the practice, even as it continued under the Empire's own nominal authority. It is a small detail, a single preserved quotation from a single advocate, but it tells you that resistance to Argonian slavery was never simply a matter of Black Marsh acting alone against Morrowind from the outside. It was also fought from within, by Argonians embedded in the very cities and institutions that profited from their people's bondage, arguing, however unsuccessfully in the short term, that the silence of respected and supposedly moral institutions was its own kind of complicity. What emerged from centuries of this practice was not passive suffering. It was resistance, organized, patient, and eventually devastating. The most striking example, one whose fingerprints you can trace directly into Skyrim's own character roster if you know where to look, is the Shadow Scales. Argonians born under a specific astrological sign, the sign of the Shadow, were according to tradition given over to the Dark Brotherhood at birth to be raised and trained as professional assassins. On its surface, this might sound like exploitation running in the opposite direction, a religious order using children as tools. But the law is explicit that the contracts given to Shadow Scales were structured to serve the interests of the Argonian people specifically, and that Shadow Scales were permitted to act with a kind of impunity within Black Marsh's borders that other Dark Brotherhood members were not granted elsewhere. It stands to reason, given everything we know about Dunmer treatment of Argonian slaves, that an order of highly trained, religiously sanctioned Argonian killers, operating with the full backing of an ancient and feared organization, would have found no shortage of former slave masters worth visiting in the dead of night. When you meet Vizara in Skyrim's own Dark Brotherhood sanctuary, an Argonian assassin who tells you plainly, in his own words, that he was once a Shadow Scale trained by the Dark Brotherhood since the day of his hatching, and that he now believes himself the last of his kind, his order extinct, you are meeting a faint, distant echo of exactly this tradition, carried forward long after the organized Shadow Scale system that originally produced fighters like him had largely faded from Black Marsh's political life. The turning point, the moment when centuries of quiet resentment curdled into something the entire continent could not ignore, came at the very end of the Third Era and the very beginning of the Fourth, and we will spend real time on the specifics of that war shortly, because it deserves its own telling. But it is worth planting the seed of it here, at the end of this chapter on chains and bondage, because the two are inseparable. The Ebonheart Pact, the alliance later formed between Dunmer, Nord, and Argonian forces in the wake of a much larger continental crisis, would eventually grant the Argonians their freedom under its terms, at least on paper, nominally outlawing slavery altogether within Pact territory. House Dreyers tellingly continued the practice anyway, wherever they thought they could get away with it. publicly dismissing accusations against them as slander, even as their plantations kept running on captive labor drawn from other non-Pactoline peoples once Argonians specifically became too politically costly to enslave openly. The freedom, in other words, was never as clean as the treaties made it sound. It was a freedom won through fear, through the credible threat of what a people who had endured centuries of bondage might do once they finally had the strength to do something about it, and that fear, as we are about to see, was entirely justified. Resistance to slavery did not only take the shape of assassins and organized rebellion either. Alongside the shadow scales, the historical record preserves the existence of an abolitionist movement called the Twin Lamps, a network that drew support not only from escaped and freed Argonian slaves themselves, but notably from sympathetic members of Morrowind's own leading great house families, individuals willing to work quietly against the very economic system that had enriched their own ancestors for generations. This detail matters because it complicates, in a useful way, the temptation to treat every Dunmer throughout this entire history as a monolithic villain and every Argonian as a monolithic victim. The truth, as it usually does, sits somewhere messier and more human than that. There were Dunmer who spent their lives working to dismantle the plantation system their own culture had built, just as there were, as we will see shortly, individual Argonians throughout this history who chose paths of cruelty, exploitation, or betrayal of their own people, rather than solidarity with them. The Twin Lamps offered a safe haven for escaped slaves fleeing captivity, a network of hidden support running counter to the official law of the land, evidence that even at the height of institutionalized bondage, the moral line between Dunmer and Argonian was never quite as clean or as absolute as the plantation owners of House Dress would have preferred everyone to believe. By the time you meet an Argonian in Skyrim, whether it is Dirkethus trapped in a Fulmer-infested cave near Darkwater Crossing, or Medesi quietly crafting jewelry in Riften's Market Square, generations have passed since the worst of the formal slave trade collapsed. But the game does not let you forget that the shadow of it lingers. It lingers in the way certain Nord characters in Windhelm speak about Argonians as lesser, as animals, echoing almost word for word the language Dunmer slavers once used to justify their own trade centuries earlier. An uncomfortable and probably deliberate parallel the writers built into the game. It lingers in the fact that an entire in-game organization of dock workers, the Argonian Assemblage we will visit later tonight, still exists as a segregated collective, still housed apart from the city proper, still doing the labor nobody else wants to do. History does not disappear just because the paperwork changes. It moves underground, into architecture, into habit, into the quiet way one people has learned to expect less from the world than another. And Skyrim, whether or not every player notices it while sprinting past on their way to the next quest marker, has built that history directly into its streets. The call that came in fire. There is a moment buried in Skyrim's broader lore, easy to miss entirely if you only ever play the base game and never dig into its historical text, that reframes the entire Argonian people as something far more formidable than the dock workers and fence merchants you typically encounter. It happened during the Oblivion Crisis, the catastrophic event at the very end of the Third Era, when the barriers between the mortal world and the realm of Oblivion cracked open across the length and breadth of Tamriel. When Daedric gates tore themselves into the landscape and armies of Mehrunes Dagon's forces poured through into cities that had no way to prepare for what was coming. Kvatch fell entirely in Cyrodiil. The imperial city itself was threatened. Province after province scrambled, disorganized and terrified, to respond to a threat that had never occurred at this scale before in recorded history. Black Marsh did not scramble. Black Marsh was ready. This detail deserves to be said slowly, because it inverts nearly every assumption an outsider might carry about the Argonians based on how thinly regarded they often are elsewhere in Tamriel's political imagination. According to the lore, the Hist itself, that same network of sentient trees whose sap the Argonians drink to receive their very souls, was able to sense the coming catastrophe and warn its people in advance. Not through official channels, not through scouts or spies or diplomatic correspondence, but through the same mystical connection that ties every Argonian back to the trees of their birth. Black Marsh's forces were mobilized and organized before the first gate had even fully opened, and when the Daedra came, as they did to every province on the continent, the Argonians were not caught flat-footed the way Cyrodiil or Skyrim's own old holds were. They met the invasion head-on, and by some accounts, they did not simply defend their own borders, they pushed back through the gates themselves, carrying the fight directly into the Deadlands, into Mehrunes Dagon's own realm, in a counter-invasion that other provinces, fighting purely defensively and purely on the back foot, never managed to mount. The result, according to the historical record, was that the Daedric gates in Black Marsh were forced closed specifically because of this Argonian counter-offensive, while Morrowind, their neighbour to the north, suffered catastrophically by comparison, its capital region devastated, its people scattered. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of this fact for a moment, because it rarely gets any airtime in the popular imagination of the Elder Scrolls world, where Argonians are so often treated, even within the games themselves, as a background race, a source of comic relief or minor quest content, rather than genuine political weight. And yet here, at one of the single most catastrophic moments in the entire history of Tamriel, when empires crumbled and gods themselves were said to walk the mortal world, it was Black Marsh, of all provinces, that came through with its organization and its unity intact, its people fighting with a coordination and a foreknowledge that far wealthier, far more militarily celebrated nations simply could not match. One interpretation, and it is an interpretation the game leaves room for without stating outright, is that this single event fundamentally altered how the Argonians understood their own capabilities as a people. For centuries, they had been the ones taken, the ones raided, the ones sold. Here, for the first time in living cultural memory, they were the ones who held the line when everyone else's line had already broken. It helps to hold this achievement up against what was happening simultaneously elsewhere on the continent, because the contrast is what makes it so remarkable. In Cyrodiil, the city of Kvatch was entirely destroyed in the opening days of the crisis, its population slaughtered or scattered before any organized defense could be mounted. Skyrim's own old holds were besieged and laid waste by Daedric forces with similarly little warning. High Chancellor Okato himself, according to surviving accounts, described cities like Bruma as virtually defenseless during this period, not from any lack of will, but from a simple absence of the kind of advanced preparation that might have let them meet the invasion on anything resembling equal footing. Province after province was, in effect, ambushed by a threat centuries of relative peace had left them unequipped to anticipate. Black Marsh alone entered the crisis already organized, already warned, already moving, and it is worth sitting with how strange that inversion would have looked to anyone watching from Cyrodiil or Skyrim at the time. The province, so often dismissed as backward and marginal, turning out to be the one place on the entire continent that met apocalypse with genuine readiness. The mechanism behind this success traces directly back to everything we discussed in the first chapter tonight. The relationship between the Hist and the Argonians that gives them their souls, their sense of identity, their entire spiritual architecture. A tree that is rooted across the whole of a province, sensing disturbances in ways no single scout or spy master ever could, is capable of a kind of early warning system that no other culture in Tamriel possesses, because no other culture has bonded itself this completely to something that is, in effect, the land itself given consciousness. The evidence points toward this being less a matter of superior training or superior weaponry, and more a matter of superior information, arriving through channels the rest of Tamriel had no way of accessing or even conceiving of. It is a sobering thought that the very thing so many outsiders look down upon, the strange, swamp-bound, tree-worshipping religion of the beast folk to the south, was the exact thing that let Blackmarsh weather a continental apocalypse better than almost anyone else. There is also something quietly poignant in the fact that this defense was not purely reactive. The sources describing the crisis in Blackmarsh use language suggesting a genuine counter-invasion, forces moving through the gates and into oblivion itself, rather than simply repelling what came through them. This suggests an aggression, a willingness to take the fight to an enemy on the enemy's own ground that stands in sharp contrast to the more passive, defensive posture most other provinces were forced into by the sheer suddenness of the crisis. It could imply that the same qualities that had once made the Argonians dangerous adversaries against slavers, patient, adaptable, capable of striking with precision when the moment allowed it, were simply redirected here against a far larger and far more monstrous target. The skills forged in centuries of resistance against Dunmer plantation owners did not vanish once slavery began to collapse under pact treaties. They were simply waiting for a target worthy of their full and undivided use. What makes this chapter of Argonian history so essential to understanding everything that happens afterward is the shift in power it represents, even if that shift was never formally recognized by the wider political structures of Tamriel. Morrowind emerged from the Oblivion Crisis and the Red Year that followed it, profoundly weakened, its capital in ruins, its tribunal gods fallen, its people scattered as refugees fleeing north into Skyrim, some of whom you can still meet living in the grey quarter of Windhelm to this day, their presence there a direct consequence of the devastation their homeland suffered during this exact period. Blackmarsh, by comparison, emerged from the same crisis largely intact, its people organized, its military capability proven on a scale that had never been demonstrated before, its confidence, quite understandably, transformed. When a people who have spent centuries as the ones being taken suddenly discover, in the crucible of the worst catastrophe their world has ever known, that they are also capable of being the ones who take, of being the ones who strike first, of being the ones whose enemies flee rather than the reverse. Something changes that cannot easily be changed back. And as we are about to see, it did not take long at all for that change to make itself known. The reckoning of the Red Year. 5 years. That is how long it took. After the Oblivion Crisis subsided and the immediate chaos of Daedric invasion faded from Tamriel's memory, for the consequences of everything we just discussed to come due in full. In the year 4 E5, an event known as the Red Year struck Morrowind directly, an eruption of Red Mountain itself, the volcanic heart of Vardenfell, an eruption catastrophic enough that some accounts tie its cause back to the lingering aftershocks of the Oblivion Crisis. Cities, were devastated. Ash and soot rained down not just across Morrowind, but spread as far as neighbouring Solstheim, the island you would later come to know quite well during your own adventures in Skyrim's Dragonborn expansion. Survivors described digging through rubble, burying the thousands who had died, wondering, in the words preserved from those who lived through it, whether this was to be their epitaph as a people. Morrowind, already reeling from the Oblivion Crisis's toll and the fall of its living tribunal gods, was as vulnerable in this single moment as it had perhaps ever been in its recorded history. The Argonians did not wait. Within a single year of the Red Year's devastation, in 4E6, the Uneasy, a radical political faction that had risen to prominence in Black Marsh, organized and launched what history would come to call the Accession War, though it is far more commonly known simply as the Argonian invasion. This was not a raid. This was not a border skirmish or a campaign of opportunistic looting while an old enemy was down. This was a full military invasion, coordinated and sustained, aimed directly at the great houses of Morrowind who had, for so many centuries, treated the Argonians as chattel to be bought, sold, and worked to death on Solstheim plantations. The invasion tore through the southern and eastern portions of the province with a speed and ferocity that stunned observers across Tamriel. Mournhold itself, Morrowind's capital city, was sacked and, according to some accounts, entirely destroyed in the fighting, an almost unthinkable outcome for a city that had stood as a centre of Dunmer civilization for centuries. House Telvanni, one of the great houses most heavily invested in the slave trade and most notorious for its brutal treatment of Argonian and Khajiit captives, came close to complete destruction. Its territories overrun as Argonian forces pushed as far north as the city of Telvos on Vardenfell itself. Vivek City, the once mighty urban centre that had already been devastated by the Red Year's eruption, saw what remained of it, a place the sources describe as having become the Scathing Bay, claimed by Argonian forces who are said to still perform rituals there on occasion, even in the present day. Only House Redrun managed to halt the Argonian advance before it could push further, and it is worth noting that this single fact, that the invasion was ultimately checked rather than completely victorious, is precisely why the war ended where it did rather than continuing, until all of Morrowind had fallen. The Anzilil, having devastated the southern and eastern reaches of the province, having sacked its capital and gutted one of its most powerful ruling houses, chose to occupy the territory they had taken rather than press onward against Redrun's defence, and in the years that followed, some Argonian tribes settled permanently into these conquered lands, a presence that persisted for a considerable period afterward. The war compounded an already dire refugee crisis. Thousands of Dunmer, having survived both the Red Year's volcanic devastation and the Argonian invasion that followed hard on its heels, fled west, some overland, some by sea, and it is directly because of this flood of displaced people that the High King of Skyrim of that era made the decision to cede control of the island of Solstheim to Morrowind, specifically so that these refugees would have somewhere to settle. Every Dunmer you meet in Raven Rock during your travels through the Dragonborn expansion is there, in a very real historical sense, because of the chain of catastrophe that began with Red Mountain's eruption and was accelerated by the Argonian reckoning that followed. The devastation of Mournhold is not only a matter of second-hand summary passed down through later historians. First-hand accounts survive from people who lived through the fall of Morrowind cities during this exact period, and their words carry a rawness that no dry recitation of troop movements and territorial losses can fully convey. One preserved journal, written by a Telvanni Dunmer named Limdren Telvanni, describes the writer sheltering in the ruined lower level of his own family home as the sound of the invading army passed by overhead in overwhelming numbers, the cries of the dying reaching him even through the floor, and the writer wondering aloud, in his own words, whether this ruin was to be his epitaph. Another account describes a massive explosion tearing through the heart of a city, as its cantons, the great suspended districts that made Vivek such an architectural marvel, collapsed entirely, the witness knocked from her feet by the force of it. These are not the words of distant chroniclers assembling a tidy narrative after the fact. They are the words of people living through the exact hours the Unzilil's invasion was breaking their world apart, and reading them alongside everything we know of the slavery that preceded this war is a genuinely uncomfortable experience, because it asks you to hold two truths at once: that this reckoning was earned many times over, and that the people caught inside it, whatever their ancestors had done, experienced it as nothing less than the end of the world they had always known. It is worth being honest about what this war represented, because it resists easy moral categorization in either direction, and a good historian, or in this case a good storyteller by the firelight, does not flatten that complexity for the sake of a cleaner narrative. On one hand, the Accession War was unambiguously an act of retribution against a people who had enslaved, brutalized, and dehumanized the Argonians for centuries, and there is a kind of grim, hard-won justice in the fact that Black Marsh, rather than remaining a permanent victim of that history, eventually possessed both the unity and the military strength to make its former oppressors pay a price commensurate with the harm done. On the other hand, the war's victims were not exclusively the slavers and plantation owners who had perpetrated that original harm. Mournhold's destruction, the devastation across southern and eastern Morrowind, claimed lives among ordinary Dunmer citizens who had no personal hand in the slave trade, whose ancestors may have participated in it generations before they were even born, and the thousands who fled as refugees towards Skyrim were fleeing a war whose roots long predated their own individual choices. History rarely allows for a reckoning that punishes only the guilty and spares the innocent, and the Accession War, like so many wars born from generations of accumulated grievance, did not manage that impossible standard either. The consequences of the war rippled outward in ways that extended well beyond the battlefield itself, reshaping trade routes, religious practice, and even simple geography for generations afterward. Vivek City's transformation into what the sources call the Scathing Bay is worth dwelling on a moment longer than we already have, because the fact that Argonian forces are described as still performing rituals there on occasion, even in the present day, suggests that the site has taken on a meaning for the Unzilil and their descendants that goes beyond simple military conquest. A city once sacred to the tribunal, home to a living god before the Red Year, and the war that followed stripped away both, has become instead a place of Argonian ceremony, an inversion so complete that it is hard to imagine anyone living through the era before the Red Year ever predicting it. Whatever these rituals actually involve, and the sources are careful not to specify, their persistence across the intervening decades tells you that the Accession War was never simply remembered by the Argonians as a military campaign to be studied by strategists. It became, instead, something closer to sacred history, worth returning to the physical ground of over and over, the way any people might return to the site of their greatest reckoning, to make sure the memory of it never fully settles into mere fact. What matters most for our purposes tonight, listening to this story unfold by the fire, is what the war permanently changed. It completed a shift in the balance of power across the region that had already begun during the Oblivion Crisis, cementing Black Marsh's position as a province that could no longer be treated as a passive source of slaves and cheap labor. It contributed directly to Morrowind's near-total independence from the Empire, since the same period saw a simultaneous political crisis called the Stormcrown Interregnum unfold. And between the two upheavals, Morrowind emerged from the era functioning as an independent nation in every practical sense, even if some imperial administrators continued referring to it as a province out of old habit or wounded pride. And it ensured that when Argonians finally did appear in significant numbers within Skyrim's borders, whether as dockworkers in Windhelm or fishmongers in Solitude, they arrived not as a broken, permanently subjugated people, but as citizens of a homeland that had, within living cultural memory, proven itself capable of striking back against one of the most historically dominant powers on the entire continent. This is the inheritance every Argonian character in Skyrim carries with them, whether the game ever states it outright or not. Somewhere behind Talange's quiet devotion to Kirava, behind Stanzin Shallow's skooma addiction, behind Gullum Ai's careful, calculating maneuvering within the East Empire Company's ranks, sits the memory, ancestral or cultural, or simply atmospheric, of a people who were once taken by force and who, when the moment finally came, took something back in return. Uneasy Neighbors. Given everything we have just covered, the sacking of Mournhold, the devastation of House Telvanni's holdings, the centuries of slavery that preceded and provoked it all, it would be easy to assume that Argonians and Dunmer, meeting anywhere on Tamriel's map, would default to open hostility. And yet the relationship, as it plays out within Skyrim itself, resists that simple assumption in ways that reward closer attention. The truth is more complicated, more historically layered, and in its own way sadder, because it suggests two peoples bound together by shared trauma and shared displacement, even while carrying the scars of what one did to the other for so many generations. Consider the Ebonheart Pact, an alliance forged many centuries before the specific events of Skyrim, deep in the Second Era, but whose logic still shapes how Argonians and Dunmer coexist in the world you explore. According to the historical record, this alliance was first forged in the wake of an Akaviri invasion, when Nords and Dunmer, threatened by a common external enemy, banded together for mutual survival and, crucially, chose to bring the Argonians into that arrangement as well, rather than leaving them as a permanently separate or hostile third party. The pact-loyal Dunmer houses, as part of the terms of this alliance, formally granted the Argonians freedom from slavery and nominally outlawed the practice altogether within their territories, even as House Telvanni, who refused to join the pact at all, continued treating Argonians as property wherever pact jurisdiction did not reach them, and even as House Dres kept finding workarounds involving other, non-pact protected peoples. This tells us something important. The end of formal Argonian slavery was not a universal moral awakening among the Dunmer. It was, in significant part, a political and military necessity, a concession made to secure an alliance that Dunmer leadership judged more valuable than the continued exploitation of Argonian labor. It stands to reason that an emancipation born from strategic calculation, rather than genuine reckoning, would leave behind resentments on both sides. Resentments that could linger for centuries, without ever being fully resolved. You do not need to travel to Morrowind to see the evidence of this uneasy, unresolved history. You can find it inside Windhelm's own walls, in the neighborhood the game calls the Grey Quarter. This district exists specifically because of the Red Year and its aftermath, populated by Dunmer, who fled Morrowind after the eruption of Red Mountain, seeking refuge in a Nord city that, as we will discuss at length in a few moments, treated them with considerable suspicion and thinly veiled hostility of its own. What is worth noting here, before we move fully into that discussion, is the strange symmetry the game constructs between the Dunmer of the Grey Quarter and the Argonians of the docks just beyond the city walls. Both are refugee or migrant populations displaced by events tied directly or indirectly to the same historical chain we have been tracing tonight. Both are treated by a significant portion of Windhelm's Nord population as unwelcome outsiders who pollute the city with their presence. To use language drawn nearly verbatim from actual in-game dialogue, you can trigger simply by walking through the city gates. And yet, despite this shared experience of displacement and discrimination at Nord hands, the game does not portray Dunmer and Argonian residents of Windhelm as natural allies bonded by common suffering. Their relationship remains cool, transactional, occasionally openly contemptuous, an echo, however faint, of centuries during which one people enslaved the other. It is worth remembering, too, that the Grey Quarter's own name carries this uneasy history embedded directly into its syllables. The district was originally known as the Snow Quarter, a name with no particular racial connotation attached to it at all, and the shift to Grey Quarter is, based on what we know from the accounts describing Windhelm's social history, most commonly explained as a reference to the ash-grey skin tone of the Dunmer refugees who came to fill it, though the game itself leaves room for other explanations depending on which of the city's own residents you happen to ask. A neighborhood's very name, renamed by the city around it, rather than chosen by the people living there, becomes a small permanent marker of how thoroughly outside eyes have defined this community, rather than the community defining itself. It is a quieter, more insidious cousin to the formal decree that keeps Argonians out of the city walls entirely, less an explicit law than an accumulated habit of language, but it works in much the same direction, marking an entire population by their difference rather than allowing them simply to be residents of the city like anyone else. You can hear this echo directly if you listen closely to how certain characters speak. There is a moment, easy to miss, if you rush through Windhelm's opening scene without lingering, where Suvaris Atheron, a Dunmer woman working the docks, can be heard grumbling about the Argonian dock workers of the Assemblage, calling them lazy, wishing they would move their tails faster, language that sits uncomfortably close to the exact dehumanizing rhetoric her own people's ancestors once used to justify Argonian enslavement in the first place. It is a small detail, easily overlooked, but it speaks to something the game seems to understand quite well. Prejudice does not require personal memory of the original wrong to perpetuate itself. It only requires inherited habits of speech, absorbed unconsciously from a culture that has never fully examined where those habits came from. Suvaris herself is a refugee, treated with contempt by the Nords around her, and yet she carries forward, seemingly without any self-awareness of the irony, a fragment of the exact prejudice her own people once directed at the Argonians on a much larger and more brutal scale. This layered, uncomfortable dynamic extends into the deeper interpersonal relationships you can uncover. If you dig into the personal stories of Skyrim's Dunmer and Argonian characters more closely, There is no grand reconciliation quest, no moment where the game explicitly stages a healing between these two peoples. What you find instead, scattered across dialogue and environmental storytelling, is something closer to coexistence without resolution. Two communities living adjacent to one another, sometimes cooperating out of necessity, sometimes carrying quiet grievances neither side ever fully voices, held together less by mutual affection than by the shared reality of being outsiders in a city that has never fully accepted either of them. One interpretation of this arrangement, and it is an interpretation that fits comfortably within everything we know of Tamriel's broader history, is that true reconciliation between the Dunmer and the Argonians was never going to be a single event, a single treaty, a single war's conclusion. It was always going to be a process measured in centuries, uneven, incomplete, and visible mostly in small, almost accidental gestures, like the fact that Argonian dockworkers and Dunmer refugees share the same city, the same weather, the same distant hope of eventually being seen as something other than strangers by the Nords who rule over them both. The new Gnesis Corner Club, tucked into the Grey Quarter itself, offers a small window into how this coexistence actually functions on a day-to-day basis rather than remaining an abstract political arrangement. It is a Dunmer-run establishment, named in honor of the city its patrons fled, and it serves as one of the few places in Windhelm where Dunmer residents can gather comfortably among their own kind, rather than navigating a city built around Nord tradition. Argonians are not barred from entering it the way they are barred from the city walls themselves, but neither is it described anywhere as a particular gathering place for them. And this absence, this quiet non-overlap between two communities who share so much of the same daily hardship, tells its own story. Suveris Atheron, the same Dunmer woman we watch being harassed at the city gates earlier tonight, works within this same social orbit, and her private grumbling about the Argonian dock workers, recorded in her own logbook, reveals a woman perfectly capable of both suffering discrimination herself and directing a smaller, meaner version of that same discrimination downward at people whose circumstances are in truth considerably worse than her own. It is not a flattering detail for the Dunmer of Windhelm, and the game does not appear interested in flattering them here. It is simply an honest observation about how oppression, left unexamined, does not always produce solidarity among its victims. Sometimes it produces new, smaller hierarchies instead, each group finding someone else to look down upon in turn. The docks, outside the walls. Nowhere in all of Skyrim is the ongoing present-tense reality of Argonian discrimination made more visible, more undeniable, than in the city of Windhelm. And unlike almost everything we have discussed so far tonight, you do not need a history book or an obscure lore text to witness it. You only need to walk through the gates, or in the case of the Argonians themselves, to be denied the chance to walk through them at all. Windhelm is described in the game's own sources as the oldest city in Skyrim. Possibly the oldest city of men anywhere on Tamriel still standing, its stones dating back to the Merethic era, long before recorded history as most other races understand it. It is a city built on age and tradition, on the idea of itself as the last unbroken bastion of true Nordic culture, and it is precisely this self-image that makes its treatment of outsiders so uncompromising. When you first arrive at Windhelm's gates, before you have even set foot inside the city proper, you may witness a scene playing out just past the entrance, where a Dunmer woman named Suveris Atheron is being harassed by two Nord men, Rolf Stonefist and Angranor Once Honoured, who accuse her outright of polluting the city with her presence, of eating food that should belong to Nords, of being, quite possibly, an Imperial spy simply because of her race. It is an ugly scene, deliberately written to be ugly, and it establishes within moments of your arrival exactly what kind of atmosphere prevails within Windhelm's walls. And this is only the treatment extended to the Dunmer, who are at least permitted to live inside the city itself, however uncomfortable that residence is made for them. The Argonians are not extended even that much. According to the game's own descriptions of the city, Argonians are explicitly prohibited from entering Windhelm proper, forced instead to live and work entirely on the docks outside the walls, a formal segregation with real teeth behind it. This is not simply informal prejudice, the kind of thing that happens through unwritten social pressure and dirty looks. It traces back to an actual decree issued by Ulfric Stormcloak himself, forbidding Argonians from residing within the city's walls, a piece of policy, not merely attitude, embedded directly into how Windhelm governs itself. If you are playing an Argonian character yourself, an attempt to simply exist inside Windhelm's gates the way any Nord or Imperial or Breton could, you will find the city's own residents reacting to your presence as something transgressive, something that violates the basic order of how things are supposed to work. It is one of the more quietly devastating pieces of environmental storytelling anywhere in the entire game, precisely because it does not announce itself with a dramatic cutscene or an emotional quest marker. It is simply the rule of the world, absorbed into the game's mechanics the same way gravity or weather is. Something you might not even notice unless you happen to be paying close attention or happen to be playing as one of the people it directly affects. On Dolomar, the Thalmor Justicia posted in Markarth is a study in the opposite temperament entirely, and though his story belongs to a different chapter of Skyrim's political landscape than the one we are tracing tonight, the wider point about Nord prejudice toward outsiders is worth returning to briefly here, because it clarifies something about how selectively that prejudice tends to be applied. Windhelm's own citizens are, on the whole, considerably less troubled by an Ultima Justicia walking their streets in an official capacity than they are by an Argonian simply trying to live inside their walls. Prejudice in Skyrim, as the game constructs it, is rarely a consistent or evenly distributed thing. It bends toward whoever a given community has decided, often for reasons buried in centuries of history, rather than anything the individual outsider has personally done, to treat as fundamentally other. And the Argonians, alongside the Dunmer, sit near the very bottom of that particular hierarchy in a city that otherwise prides itself on ancient tradition and hospitality toward those it considers worthy of it. There is a smaller, almost comic detail buried within Windhelm's opening scene that nonetheless deserves mention, because it shows how thoroughly this hostility saturates the city, rather than being confined to a single bitter man standing at the gate. The scene involving Rolf Stonefist and Suveris Atheron can, under the right circumstances, escalate into a formal brawl. The game itself labels Fight, Fight, a title so casual it almost sounds like a playground taunt, rather than the name given to a confrontation rooted in generations of ethnic resentment. Winning that brawl earns you gold, and eventually, something the game frames as Rolf's grudging respect. But the fact that Windhelm's deepest prejudices can be resolved, mechanically speaking, with a single fistfight and a wager of 100 septims, says something quietly damning about how easily the game allows a player to feel they have addressed a problem that, as we have already discussed, remains entirely unmoved by any individual act of physical dominance. Rolf loses a bar fight. The decree keeping Argonians on the docks remains exactly where it was before you ever set foot in the city. The building where the city's Argonian population actually lives is called the Argonian Assemblage, located at the western end of the docks, and everything about its physical description underscores the point the game is making. It is described as dark, run-down, in disrepair, a place perfectly suited, in the words used to characterize it, for the prejudiced and proud Nords of Windhelm to keep their unwanted Argonian workers. The building is secured with what the game classifies as a master-level lock, one of the more difficult tiers of security in Skyrim's lockpicking system, which resets itself with unusual frequency, effectively trapping its own residents inside overnight unless someone happens to unlock the door for them the next morning. And in one of the more quietly cruel details buried in the game's mechanics, even if you yourself are playing as an Argonian character, you will still receive a bounty for trespassing if you are caught inside the assemblage without permission, unless you happen to be married to one of its residents. The game does not even grant automatic solidarity along racial lines here. It simply treats the assemblage as private property that anyone, Argonian or otherwise, can be punished for entering uninvited. A small but telling detail about how thoroughly the segregation has been normalized into the fabric of how Windhelm's laws actually function. The residents of the assemblage are drawn in the game with real specificity, not as a faceless mass, but as individuals whose daily lives you can watch unfold in granular detail if you spend enough time observing them. Stands in Shallows, who works the docks from morning until evening every single day regardless of weather. Struggling visibly with a skooma addiction he cannot seem to shake, at one point admitting that he feels as though his own scales are clawing into him when the craving becomes too intense. Scouts, Many Marshes and Shavi, both potential candidates for marriage should you choose to pursue that path. Living lives defined almost entirely by the same grinding, unglamorous dockside labour. The work available to them is limited to what the docks themselves can offer. Fishing, hauling cargo, tanning hides, the physical, exhausting jobs that keep a port city running, but that carry none of the prestige or comfort available to residents permitted inside the walls proper. And this labour happens, as the game explicitly notes, no matter the weather, meaning that while Windhelm's Nord citizens can retreat indoors from Skyrim's brutal winters, the Argonians working its docks have no such option. Their daily survival dependent on continuing to work regardless of how harsh the conditions become. It would be a mistake to treat Rolf Stonefist, the most openly, cartoonishly bigoted character associated with this whole dynamic, as an isolated bad apple rather than a symptom of something structural. Rolf spends much of his time in Candlehearth Hall, drinking, before stumbling out late at night specifically to harass the residents of the Grey Quarter, hurling insults at anyone he encounters who is not a Nord. His hatred is explicit, personal and directed, but the game is careful to show you that his individual cruelty exists within a much larger frame of institutional exclusion that would persist even if Rolf himself were removed from the picture entirely. You can, if you choose, challenge him to a brawl and beat him, and afterward, his personal disposition toward you may soften somewhat. He may even greet you as a friend if you are the one who defeated him. But defeating Rolf in a fistfight does not unlock Windhelm's gates for the Argonians standing just beyond them. It does not tear down the master-level lock on the assemblage. It does not repeal Ulfric's decree. The game is, in its own understated way, making a point here that deserves real credit. Individual prejudice and institutional discrimination are related but distinct problems, and defeating the loudest bigot in the room does not, by itself, dismantle the structure that made his bigotry function with impunity in the first place. There is one path forward the game does offer, though it is conditional and far from guaranteed. Should the Imperial Legion take control of Windhelm over the course of Skyrim's Civil War questline, Brunwulf Free Winter becomes the city's new Jarl, and Brunwulf is explicitly characterized as a supporter of both the Dunmer and the Argonian populations, someone who genuinely wishes to see conditions improve for both communities. Even here, though, the game resists an easy fairy tale resolution. Brunwulf, as we touched on earlier in a different context, still believes the Argonians should remain outside the city walls, even under his more sympathetic administration. A detail that suggests even the most well-intentioned Nord leadership in the game's imagination cannot fully imagine dismantling the segregation entirely, only softening its edges. It is a bleakly realistic touch, one that resists the temptation to hand players a clean, happy ending in exchange for a single quest choice, and it leaves the Argonian assemblage standing exactly where it always stood, its residents still living and working outside the walls of a city that has called itself home to their labor for generations, while never quite calling them, in return, its own. Voices from the assemblage and beyond, history and social structure, only take a story so far. What gives the Argonian presence in Skyrim its real weight, its real texture, is the individual characters scattered throughout the game whose personal stories taken together form a kind of composite portrait of what it actually means to be Saxhleel, making a life in a land that was never built with them in mind. Tonight, we will walk through several of the most significant of these figures, moving from Windhelm's docks outward across the rest of Skyrim, tracing the different ways this single people has found to survive, to love, to scheme, and to endure. We have already spent time with several residents of the Argonian assemblage, but it is worth returning briefly to consider them alongside one another, because the contrast between them tells its own story. Stands in shallows, struggling openly with skooma addiction, willing to ask a passing stranger for help, stealing a bottle when his cravings become unbearable, represents one particular outcome of a life spent in grinding, unglamorous labor with little hope of advancement. And it is worth remembering, from everything we discussed earlier regarding Black Marsh's own tribal history and the way skooma addiction was once cynically used by outside forces as leverage against Argonian populations, that his struggle carries an uncomfortable historical echo. Whether the game's writers intended that specific resonance or not, Scouts Many Marshes and Shavi, by contrast, appear to have found something closer to stability within the limited options available to them, both willing to consider marriage, both continuing their daily labor without the same visible desperation that defines Stands in Shallows' daily routine. 3 lives, all shaped by the same institutional confinement, all arriving at different personal equilibriums within it. This is, in its own way, more honest than a simpler story would have been. Oppression does not produce identical people. It produces a range of responses, some more broken than others, some more resilient, and Windhelm's docks contain examples of nearly the full spectrum. Travel south to Riften, and you find a very different picture of Argonian life, one less defined by formal segregation and more defined by quiet, hard-won domestic happiness carved out against considerable odds. Talonjay works behind the counter of the Bee and Barb, deeply devoted to Keirava, the inn's proprietor, and if you take the time to speak with him at length, you will learn that he first met her years earlier, when he wandered into Riften and found himself smitten from that very first encounter. His entire questline revolves around his desire to complete a proper engagement ring in the Black Marsh tradition, a detail worth lingering on, because it means that even here, in a city hundreds of miles from Black Marsh itself, surrounded by a population that is overwhelmingly not Argonian, Talon J has held on to a specific cultural practice from his homeland, insisting on doing this one thing the way his own people would do it, rather than simply adopting whatever local custom might have been easier or more expected. Completing his ring requires 3 flawless amethysts, gems he cannot easily afford on his modest earnings as a barkeep. And if you choose to help him gather them, you become part of a small, quiet act of cultural continuity, an Argonian tradition being honored and completed in the heart of a Nord city that, elsewhere in Skyrim, treats Argonians as unwelcome outsiders, unfit even to live within certain city walls. Kerava, for her part, is revealed through the game's Thieves Guild questline to come from a family that owns and runs a farm back in Morrowind, a small detail suggesting a broader Argonian diaspora spread even into Dunmer territory, further evidence of how thoroughly this people has scattered across the map of Tamriel in the centuries since slavery's collapse. Not every Argonian storyline carries this same warmth. In Solitude, at a tucked-away table inside the Winking Skeever, you will eventually cross paths with Gulamai, a dock worker connected to the East Empire Company, whose easygoing manner conceals a figure of careful, calculated self-interest, entangled deeply enough in the city's criminal underworld to sit at the center of one of the Thieves Guild's more morally ambiguous questlines. And in that same city, far to the north of Riften, you encounter a very different arrangement entirely. Jarira and his sister Dija, both Argonians working ostensibly for the East Empire Company, running a criminal racket on the side with a group calling themselves the Black Blood Marauders. Their scheme, deceptively simple on its surface, involves luring the player into extinguishing the beacon of the Solitude Lighthouse, causing an incoming cargo ship called the Ice Runner to run aground on the rocks below, its crew slaughtered by the waiting marauders, its cargo plundered clean. What makes this particular story worth pausing on is its final betrayal. Jarira never intends to actually reward the player for their help. He sends them instead to his sister Dija, who's waiting in the wreck's hold, whose true purpose is simply to kill whoever completes the job so that no payment ever has to be made and no loose ends are left standing. It is a bleak, cynical little narrative, and it is worth noting that it sits uncomfortably close in tone and mechanism, if not in specific detail, to Riften's own long tradition of shipwreck plundering and criminal opportunism that runs throughout so much of Skyrim's underworld storytelling. Whatever grand, sympathetic history we have traced tonight, regarding the Argonians as a people wronged and eventually vindicated, the game is careful not to sand down every individual Argonian character into pure victim or pure hero. Jarira and Dija are villains in their own small corner of the world, their crimes not excused by the broader weight of Argonian history, simply set alongside it as a reminder that no people, however historically wronged, is made up exclusively of saints. There is more to Gulamai's story than his role as a dockside contact for the East Empire Company, and it is worth returning to him briefly before moving forward, because his questline offers one of the more elaborate individual Argonian narratives found anywhere in the game. When the Thieves Guild finds itself sabotaged from within by an unknown rival, the trail of evidence eventually points toward Gulamai as a former guild contact who may know who is behind it, and confronting him at the Winking Skeever reveals a man far more entangled in guild business and far more willing to trade information for his own safety, than his easygoing dockside manner might initially suggest. He can be persuaded, through either intimidation or a well-placed bribe, to lead you on a careful, watchful walk from the tavern down toward the East Empire Company's warehouse and the smuggling tunnels beneath it, eventually revealing what he knows about who has been working against the guild, information that turns out to trace back to a wronged guild member named Carlia, and, through her, to the deeper corruption running through the guild's own leadership under Mercer Frey. What makes this worth mentioning here, in the context of everything we have discussed tonight, is how thoroughly Gulamai represents a particular survival strategy available to an Argonian operating within institutions, whether criminal or legitimate, that were never built with his people's interests in mind. He does not fight the system the way the Anzalil once did. He does not simply endure it quietly the way so many of the Windhelm dock workers do. He works it angle by angle, information traded for safety, safety traded for continued profit, always calculating which alliance costs him the least and protects him the most. It is not an especially noble strategy, and the game does not ask you to admire him for it, but it is a recognizable one, and it sits alongside everything else we have discussed tonight as one more thread in the wider pattern of how individual Argonians, scattered across a land that was never built to welcome them, have each found their own particular way of getting by. Elsewhere, the game offers something closer to genuine heroism, or at least genuine tragedy handled with dignity. Derkethus, an Argonian ranger and miner living near Darkwater Crossing in East March, goes missing after venturing out to explore the pools near his home, and the surrounding townsfolk, worried after an extended silence, eventually direct any curious traveller toward the possibility that something has gone wrong. What you find deep within a cave called Darkwater Pass is Derkethus trapped in a cell, held captive by Former, the twisted, blind Former snow elves who infest much of Skyrim's underground. Rescuing him and escorting him safely back to Darkwater Crossing is treated by the game as a genuinely meaningful act, one that increases his disposition towards you considerably, and Derkethus stands out among Skyrim's Argonian characters as the only one available to become an actual travelling companion and follower, accompanying you on further adventures should you choose to bring him along, and remaining eligible for marriage alongside scouts, many marshes and Shavi. As one of only a small handful of Argonians, the game allows you to build a life with in this specific way. There is something quietly significant in the fact that Derkethus, once rescued, simply resumes his ordinary routine in Darkwater Crossing, mining, sleeping on his camp bed, living a life defined by steady, unremarkable labor rather than grand adventure, unless the player specifically chooses to pull him back into a larger story. It is a small, human detail, or perhaps we should say a small, Saxhleel detail, suggesting that most Argonians in Skyrim, like most people anywhere, are not seeking heroism. They are simply trying to get through their days, to do their work, to come home safely, and it is only the intervention of outside forces, whether former captors or curious travellers with a habit of pulling strangers into their own adventures, that disrupts this quiet rhythm at all. Not every Argonian story in Skyrim is about a life fully lived, and one of the more haunting examples of this can be found wandering quite literally in circles along the docks outside the Riften fishery. A female Argonian named From Deepest Fathoms can be encountered there once you have reached a certain level of experience, pacing without apparent purpose, muttering to herself in fragments that make little sense until you actually stop to speak with her. She is carrying, she explains with obvious distress, an item she calls the lexicon, an ornate cube whose presence has become a burden she cannot continue bearing, and she begs whoever will listen to take it from her and return it to a ruin called Avanchenzel, far to the west, where it belongs. She offers no real explanation for how she came to possess it, or why its weight has become unbearable, only the raw, repeated plea to be freed of it. If you agree to carry the lexicon back to Avanchenzel yourself, the full story behind her distress unspools gradually as you explore the ruin, not through dialogue delivered directly to you, but through a set of ghostly apparitions who reenact over and over the final expedition that led to this exact moment. Among these spectral figures is Watches the Roots, an Argonian warrior who, alongside From Deepest Fathoms and 2 other companions, once ventured into Avanchenzel as thieves hired to steal the very lexicon that would eventually torment her for so long afterward. You follow their echoes deeper into the ruin, listening to arguments about payment and danger grow more strained the further in they travel, until you eventually find Watches, the Roots' actual body, killed by a death trap of spinning blades meant to guard the lexicon's true resting place, his companions pressing forward without him even as his death should have been warning enough to turn back. It is a small, self-contained tragedy, easy to miss entirely if you never happen to encounter From Deepest Fathoms circling the docks at just the right moment. And it adds one more entry to the wider pattern we have traced throughout tonight's journey. An Argonian undone not by slavery or war or discrimination this time, but by simple mercenary ambition and a Dwemer ruin that did not care what race of thief came looking for its secrets, only that they never should have come at all. There are smaller figures too, easy to overlook amid Skyrim's much larger cast of characters, whose brief appearances still add texture to the overall picture. Madesi, the jeweler, working a modest stall in Riften's Market Square, whose storyline intersects with the city's political corruption when he is falsely accused of a crime he did not commit, his innocence eventually provable if you take the trouble to investigate properly, rather than simply accepting the easiest available answer. Beamja, an Argonian sorcerer encountered outside Ironbind Barrow, cautious and methodical, urging his adventuring partner to gather her strength before rushing headlong into danger. A small character sketch of temperament, patience over impulsiveness, that stands in quiet contrast to some of the more reckless, human, and elven adventurers scattered throughout the rest of the game. And Vizara, whom we touched on earlier in the context of the Shadow Scales, an Argonian assassin serving within Skyrim's own Dark Brotherhood sanctuary, describing himself as possibly the last of an order he considers all but extinct, a title that implies an entire tradition, an entire lineage of trained killers that is mostly faded from living memory by the time you actually meet him, leaving him as perhaps the final inheritor of a craft and a history he can no longer fully pass on to anyone else. Not every Argonian in Skyrim lives within sight of a city gate at all, and it is worth travelling further afield to appreciate just how widely this diaspora has scattered itself across the province. East of Morthal, in a modest mining encampment called Stone Hills, you will find Tiber I, working the iron veins of Rockwallow Mine, under the employ of Sorley the Builder. Tiber I refers to himself in the third person, a linguistic habit shared by several Argonians and Khajiit throughout Skyrim, and his dialogue carries a persistent undertone of quiet disappointment that is easy to miss if you do not stop to actually listen to him. He remarks more than once that he never imagined, as a hatchling, that his life would carry him to a mine in a place this cold, that greater things were once dreamt of, that this is not where he was meant to live out the rest of his days. There is no grand tragedy attached to Tiber I's story, the way there is with some of the other Argonians we have discussed tonight. He is simply a person whose life took him somewhere he never expected and never particularly wanted, doing steady, unglamorous work far from whatever warmer future he once imagined for himself, and finding what small comfort he can in Stonehill's relative warmth compared to the rest of Skyrim's brutal winters. Should the Stormcloaks ever take Hjalmarch during the Civil War, Tibar I is elevated to housecarl for Sorli once she becomes Jarl of Morthal, which would make him, by a fairly wide margin, the highest-ranking Argonian anywhere in the entire province. An almost accidental promotion for a character whose own dialogue suggests he never once imagined that kind of standing being available to him. It is a small, understated detail, buried in a settlement most players will only pass through once or twice, but it is worth noting given how rare institutional advancement is for any Argonian character elsewhere in the game. Back on the Windhelm docks, standing alongside stands in Shallows, Scouts Many Marshes and Shavi, there is a fourth resident of the Argonian Assemblage, worth mentioning by name. Nitranaza works the same grinding dockside labour as his neighbours, but his particular temperament runs bitter rather than resigned, his dialogue carrying an open, unconcealed disdain for the Nords he works for that the other Assemblage residents tend to keep more carefully hidden beneath politeness or exhaustion. And yet, should you approach him as a fellow Argonian rather than an outsider, his greeting shifts entirely, warm and welcoming in a way it never is toward anyone else, addressing you as egg brother or egg sister, a small linguistic detail that reveals just how much kinship language, drawn from the shared experience of the hatching pools we discussed earlier tonight, still structures how Argonians recognize and speak to one another even here. Thousands of miles from Black Marsh, on a cold dock outside a city that will not let them through its gates. In Riften, meanwhile, a very different and considerably sadder story plays out around a woman named Ujita, who works the docks and the fishery under her employer Boli. Ujita struggles with a skooma addiction severe enough to threaten her livelihood entirely, and if you approach her while the addiction still holds its grip, she will plead for your help rather than for coin. Terrified specifically of losing her position at the fishery, a job that by her own account keeps her fed and, however precariously, keeps her housed at Helga's bunkhouse. Once you help her recover, using nothing more than a simple healing potion, she will call you Hatchling of the Heart, a term of genuine familial affection, and confide that the information she can now offer about her former dealer might help root out a wider skooma trade operating throughout the city, a thread that, if pulled, can eventually lead toward earning the title of Thane of Riften. It is worth pausing on how many of Skyrim's Argonian storylines circle back to skooma, specifically stands in Shallows on the Windhelm docks, Ujita here in Riften, and Usha, whom we will meet shortly on Solstheim. This repetition does not feel accidental once you remember everything we discussed earlier tonight about skooma's original weaponization against Argonian populations, deliberately supplied by outside forces looking to create dependency and leverage among a people already stripped of so much else. Whether or not the game's individual writers intended each of these characters to echo that specific history, the pattern that emerges across the whole of Skyrim is a quiet, cumulative one. This is a people whose vulnerability to addiction, wherever the game chooses to show it, was never simply a personal failing, but the long shadow of a much older and more deliberate exploitation. Taken together, these characters resist any single tidy summary. There is no one Argonian experience represented in Skyrim, no single archetype the game reduces this entire people down to. There are addicts and there are devoted partners. There are con artists willing to murder for silence, and there are quiet heroes who ask for nothing beyond being allowed to go home safely after a hard day's work. There are tradition keepers holding on to black marsh customs thousands of miles from the swamps that gave those customs meaning. And there are assassins carrying forward fragments of orders whose full context has already begun slipping away. This range, this refusal to flatten an entire people into a single narrative, is itself perhaps the most honest tribute the game manages to pay to everything we have discussed tonight regarding Argonian history, a people who survived slavery, who fought a war that reshaped an entire province, who maintain a spiritual relationship with sentient trees that no other culture on Tamriel can claim. We're never going to fit neatly into one story. Skyrim, to its considerable credit, does not force them to. Echoes on Solstheim. When your travels eventually carry you across the sea to Solstheim, the island explored in Skyrim's Dragonborn expansion, you arrive somewhere shaped by the very history we spent so much time tracing tonight, even though the island's own present-day population is overwhelmingly Dunmer rather than Argonian. This is worth remembering as you walk through Raven Rock streets, because the island's very existence as a place of Dunmer refuge traces directly back to the chain of catastrophe we discussed earlier: the Red Year's eruption, the devastation of Morrowind, and the seeding of Solstheim by Skyrim's High King, specifically to accommodate refugees fleeing both the volcanic disaster and, indirectly, the Argonian invasion that followed hard on its heels. In a very real sense, every Dunmer you meet in Raven Rock is there because of the same historical current that once carried Argonian armies through the streets of Mournhold. Argonians themselves appear on Solstheim in smaller numbers, but their presence is not absent, and where it does appear, it tends to reinforce many of the same patterns you have already learned to recognize from the mainland. The Windhelm docks, the departure point for anyone sailing across to Solstheim in the first place, are themselves staffed and populated by the same Argonian dock workers we spent considerable time with earlier tonight, meaning that the very act of beginning your journey to Solstheim requires passing through and often interacting with the exact community whose segregation and daily labor we already explored in depth. Gjalund Saltsage, the Nord captain who ferries travelers across to the island aboard his ship the Northern Maiden, operates his passage business from this same dockside, meaning the entire threshold between Skyrim and Solstheim runs directly through the same waters the Argonian Assemblage looks out upon every single day of their working lives. A group of people permanently positioned at the very edge of two provinces, facilitating travel and trade for others, while remaining largely excluded from the fruits of that trade themselves. Once on the island itself, Solstheim's own recent history offers an interesting point of contrast to everything we know about Black Marsh's relationship with slavery and forced labor. The island had previously been explored during an earlier era in Elder Scrolls history, and its current population, established primarily through Dunmer resettlement in the wake of the Red Year, carries with it the accumulated culture and habits of a people who, as we discussed earlier, were themselves deeply implicated in the historical enslavement of Argonians on the mainland. This raises a quiet, unresolved question that the game itself never directly addresses, but that becomes hard to avoid once you have spent an evening tracing the full sweep of Argonian history the way we have tonight. What does it mean for Argonians passing through or settling on an island populated by descendants and survivors of the very great houses whose economic system was built for centuries on Argonian bondage? The game does not stage any explicit confrontation over this question within the Dragonborn expansion's main narrative, but the underlying tension sits there nonetheless, embedded in the geography itself, in the simple fact that Raven Rock exists at all, because Morrowind's great houses needed somewhere for their refugees to go. After their homeland was devastated in a war the Argonians themselves had launched against the very system of slavery those refugees' ancestors had upheld. Trade and commerce, rather than settlement, appear to be the primary channels through which broader Black Marsh culture continues to touch Solstheim's daily life. The presence of merchants and traders moving goods between Skyrim, Solstheim, and the wider network of ports scattered across northern Tamriel means that Argonian-associated goods, from crafted items to alchemical ingredients like heath sap itself, likely continue to circulate through Solstheim's markets even without a large resident Argonian population directly on the island. It stands to reason, given everything we know about the broader Argonian diaspora. Dock workers in Windhelm, jewelers in Riften, dock hands and rogue sailors in Solitude, farm-owning families with roots stretching back into Morrowind itself. That Solstheim's own economy, however Dunmer-dominated its visible population may appear, does not exist in complete isolation from this same network of Argonian labour and trade that quietly underpins so much of the wider region's commerce. One Argonian presence on Solstheim deserves to be told in full, because it is quieter and sadder than nearly anything else we have discussed tonight, and because you have to go looking for it, rather than stumbling across it by accident. North of a location called Ashfallow Citadel, behind a barred gate spanning a mountain stream, hidden well enough that most travellers to Solstheim will never find it at all, unless they take the trouble to climb the surrounding mountainside and work their way around from above, lies the body of an Argonian named Usha. He is found lying still on a bedroll, several empty skooma bottles scattered at his side, 3 more full bottles left untouched on a nearby table, alongside a lantern and a small purse of coin. Beside him, on a second table, sit 6 chunks of raw gold ore, evidence of labour he was still performing even as the addiction that would eventually kill him continued to tighten its grip. And on that same table, waiting to be found by whoever eventually discovers his body, sits a letter from his lover, the last piece of correspondence Usha ever received. Tucked away in a hidden, barred-off corner of an island, most travellers pass through quickly on their way to somewhere more dramatic. There is no quest attached to Usha. No marker draws your attention to him. He is simply there, patient and unclaimed. Exactly the kind of environmental storytelling Skyrim excels at when it wants to say something true without ever having to explain itself. A miner, an Argonian far from Black Marsh, working gold ore alone in a hidden corner of Solstheim, loved by someone who wrote to him, undone in the end by the same substance that has quietly haunted so many Argonian storylines throughout the whole of this history, dying with proof of both his labour and his love laid out side by side on the same small table, found by no one until, perhaps, you. The East Empire Company's presence on both sides of this journey deserves a closer look as well, because it forms an economic thread running quietly beneath nearly everything we have discussed tonight without ever announcing itself as significant. The same company that employs Jari Ra and Deja in Solitude, that Gulam I serves as a contact for in that same city, maintains a regional office and shipping operation at the Windhelm docks as well, situated only a short walk from the Argonian Assemblage itself, meaning that the Assemblage's residents live and work in the immediate shadow of an organization whose commercial reach extends across the entire region, connecting Windhelm to Solitude to Solstheim in a single continuous network of trade. It stands to reason that an organization this large, operating in so many of the same spaces where Argonians have been pushed to the margins, would come to depend on Argonian labor at nearly every point along its routes, without ever crediting that labor with any particular importance. The dock workers loading crates in Windhelm, the informant weighing every trade in Solitude, the rogue running a racket out of that same city's company offices, and the miner working gold ore alone somewhere north of Ashfallow Citadel are not, in the end, entirely separate stories. They are different points along the same commercial skeleton that holds much of Skyrim's economy together. A skeleton that could not function nearly as smoothly without an entire people. The game otherwise treats as background scenery, quietly keeping it moving. There is a broader lesson embedded in this relative Argonian absence from Solstheim's population, one that becomes clearer only once you have traced the full arc of the history we covered tonight. The island stands as a monument, whether the game intends it this specifically or not, to exactly how thoroughly the consequences of the Argonian people's historical reckoning with their former slavers reshaped the map of the entire region. Solstheim exists in its current Dunmer majority form, precisely because the Argonians finally fought back hard enough and successfully enough to displace an entire population across the sea. And yet the island itself remains a place the Argonians, having won that reckoning, largely chose not to settle themselves, content instead to remain concentrated in Blackmarsh proper and scattered in smaller diaspora communities across mainland Skyrim, rather than expanding outward to claim more territory in the wake of their military and political success. This restraint, whether born of practical limitation, cultural preference, or simple lack of interest in imperial expansion, tells us something important about the character of the Argonian people as a whole that we will spend the remainder of tonight's journey exploring more directly. A people who, having finally proven themselves capable of conquest, chose overwhelmingly not to pursue it any further than the specific reckoning that history had already demanded of them. Scales and silence. Step back now from the individual stories, from the wars and the docks and the quiet romances carried out over amethyst rings, and consider what the accumulated details of Argonian culture, gathered from every corner of Skyrim's world, actually reveal about how this people understands itself, its body, and its place in the world. Because even here, in the smallest and most mechanical corners of the game's design, in the racial ability screen, you might have skimmed past without a second thought when you first created your character, there is meaning worth sitting with. Consider the physical traits themselves. Argonians possess a natural resistance to disease, a trait the game frames simply as useful racial flavor, but one that carries genuine weight once placed alongside everything we know of Blackmarsh's history. This is, after all, a homeland so thick with disease that it is credited, in some interpretations, with actively deterring large-scale Dunmer invasion for centuries, since Dunmer bodies possessed no comparable natural defense against the swamp's pathogens. An entire people shaped by generations of survival within one of the most biologically hostile environments in Tamriel, their bodies quite literally adapted by necessity to endure conditions that would kill most outsiders outright. Their ability to breathe underwater speaks to the same origin. A homeland defined as much by water as by land, swamps and marshes and river deltas, rather than the solid, dry ground most other peoples of Tamriel build their lives upon. And their signature ability, Hisskin, allowing an Argonian to call upon rapid, accelerated healing for a brief period once per day, ties directly back into everything we discussed at the very beginning of tonight's journey. It is not simply a magical trick. It is described explicitly as invoking the power of the Hist itself, meaning that even in the heat of desperate combat, thousands of miles from Blackmarsh, an Argonian in Skyrim can still reach back across that distance and draw, however briefly, on the same ancient connection that gave them their soul in the first place. Every time an Argonian character in your travels calls upon this power to survive a dangerous fight, they are, in a very real sense, calling home. Names carry their own quiet history, and Argonian naming conventions are considerably more layered than they might first appear if you have only ever glanced at character names in passing. There are two distinct traditions at work throughout Argonian culture, and the tension between them mirrors the broader tension between Black Marsh's own insular traditions and the pressures of assimilation into the wider Tamrielic world. Gel names, the native language of the Saxhleel themselves, tend to be short, sibilant, often built from single words or hyphenated compounds. Names like Visera or Beamja or Talanjay, sounds that do not map easily onto the phonetics of Cyrodiilic or the common tongue spoken across most of the rest of Tamriel. These are, in the fullest sense, names the Hist itself is said to influence, assigned before an egg has even fully hatched, carrying a private cultural weight that outsiders can pronounce but never fully access. Alongside these sit what are often called Cyrodiilic or Tamrielic names. Descriptive, sometimes strikingly literal titles like Stands in Shallows or Scouts Many Marshes or Watches the Roots. Names built from an outsider-facing tradition that translates or approximates something about the individual's character, habits, or notable deeds into a form the rest of Tamriel can more easily read and remember. It stands to reason that an Argonian carrying a Gel name has, in some sense, kept a piece of Black Marsh with them, more completely than one who goes by a descriptive Tamrielic title, though both traditions remain fully legitimate and widely used throughout Argonian society, existing side by side rather than one replacing the other. Notice, if you go back through the list of characters we discussed tonight, how many carry hyphenated or single-word Gel-style names, even while living permanently among Nords and Dunmer, who cannot always pronounce them easily. It is a small, constant act of cultural persistence, repeated every single time someone introduces themselves by their given name, rather than adopting something simpler for their neighbour's convenience. Then there is the matter of the egg itself, and the belief structure surrounding Argonian birth that we touched on at the very beginning of tonight's journey, but that deserves to be returned to now, with the fuller context of everything we have since discussed. Argonian hatchlings, according to their own tradition, begin life not as individual souls in the way most other peoples of Tamriel would understand the term, but as bodies awaiting a soul, which is granted only through contact with his sap, near the hatching pools where their eggs are placed. This detail becomes considerably more poignant once you consider how disruptive slavery and displacement must have been to a tradition built around this specific, geographically rooted ritual. An Argonian born in captivity on a Dunmer plantation far from Black Marsh, deprived of access to any history at all, would, by the logic of their own culture's beliefs, face a genuinely uncertain spiritual status, a hatchling potentially never receiving the soul. Their tradition says they are owed by right of birth. It is considered rare, according to the broader law, for a hatchling to be born successfully outside of Black Marsh, precisely because of this dependency, though not impossible, and the very existence of Argonian characters across Skyrim, who were clearly born and raised far from their homeland, suggests either that this rarity has become considerably more common in the centuries since slavery scattered so many Argonian families across the map, or that individual Argonians have found ways to adapt their own spiritual practices to survive without full access to the tradition their ancestors would have considered essential. Either way, it points toward a quiet, ongoing spiritual improvisation happening throughout the entire Argonian diaspora. An entire people continuing to practice and adapt a faith built around a homeland that increasingly fewer of them will ever actually see with their own eyes. There is also something worth noting in how the game's own mechanics quietly encode a stealth and survival philosophy into the Argonian character before you have made a single choice about how to play them. Character creation grants Argonians a natural bonus toward lockpicking, along with smaller advantages in alteration, restoration, pickpocketing, and sneaking. An unusually broad spread across skills, oriented almost entirely around getting into places quietly, getting out of trouble quickly, and surviving encounters other races might not walk away from cleanly. None of these bonuses relate to open combat prowess or raw magical dominance the way certain other races are built around. They describe instead a people whose default toolkit is built for evasion, patience, and precision rather than confrontation, an inclination that lines up uncomfortably well with everything we know about a history spent finding ways to survive within systems built by more powerful outside forces, whether that meant slipping past a plantation guard in Morrowind, or picking the lock on a segregated bunkhouse door in Windhelm, that resets itself far more often than it should. There is one more piece of cultural evidence worth examining tonight, and it is, on its surface, the least dignified thing we will discuss by this fire all evening, though it reveals something worth sitting with all the same. Scattered throughout Skyrim, tucked onto bedside tables and bookshelves in locations ranging from Helga's bunkhouse in Riften to the Skull Village on Solstheim, you can find copies of a bawdy stage play called The Lusty Argonian Maid, a piece of in-universe theatre and literature centred on a fictional Argonian servant named Lifts Her Tail and her wealthy employer, Crantius Colto. It is played entirely for comedy within the world of the game, a wink at the audience rather than a serious piece of Argonian representation, and it would be easy to dismiss it as nothing more than a joke the developers included for a laugh. But consider what it means that this particular fictional archetype, an Argonian servant defined by servility and innuendo for the entertainment of others, turns up scattered so widely across the province, found in noble manors and mining camps and remote villages alike, seemingly far more often than any in-game text that might actually describe the Hist, or the Accession War, or the real lived conditions of the Argonian assemblage down on Windhelm's docks. It stands to reason, given everything we have traced tonight, about how thoroughly this people has been reduced by outside cultures throughout history, first to chattel on Dunmer plantations, then to segregated dock labour under Nord decree, that a comic archetype like Lifts Her Tail found such fertile ground to spread precisely because so few of the people reading and laughing at her ever bothered to learn anything truer about the culture she was supposedly drawn from. The joke requires ignorance to land, and the apparent imbalance between how often this play turns up compared to any serious text about Argonian history or belief says something quietly telling about which version of this people the wider culture of Tamriel has found easiest to remember, and which version it has found easiest to forget. What emerges from all these smaller details taken together is a portrait of a people whose culture is defined less by rigid uniformity and more by resilient adaptation. A body built to survive disease and drowning. A naming tradition that holds two languages in careful balance rather than letting one erase the other. A religious practice built around a specific homeland that nonetheless finds ways to persist, however imperfectly, in dockside taverns and mining towns thousands of miles from the nearest history. This is not the portrait of a broken people, Despite everything we know of the slavery and displacement and ongoing discrimination that has shaped so much of their history, it is the portrait of a people who have learned across many centuries and under enormous pressure exactly how much of themselves they can carry forward into hostile or indifferent territory, and exactly how to keep carrying it generation after generation without ever quite setting it down.